They're the tiny delicacies that everyone has an instant reaction to. One side, they're amazing! The other side, they're horrific! No, I'm not talking about chicken McNuggets, although those are pretty good, I think. I'm talking, of course, about the beautiful bivalve known as the oyster. Whether you can't stand oysters or you think they're absolutely delicious, these mighty mollusks are very visceral. But what exactly is an oyster? How many different kinds of oysters are there? And do they really help get your mojo back, if you know what I'm saying? Well, today we're exploring the world of oysters. But before I jump in, and if you're feeling fancy, be sure to subscribe to Come to Cheesus. Cheesus will bless you for this, and let me know what other food topics you would like to explore. Okay, get ready. We're going to shell. Now, if you've ever eaten oysters, you know that they can taste wildly different. Several families of saltwater bivalve mollusks make up what we commonly call oysters. Hundreds of varieties of oysters are harvested and sold. Many are named after the bed or farm that grew them. Since oysters feed on the water around them, everything around the place where they are grown can affect the taste. So oysters from different bodies of water or from different areas of water, even in the same city and state, can taste very different. In fancy foodie terms, their local habitat is called a merroir, which is kind of like terroir, but for the sea. Kind of like chicken of the sea, right? No, nothing like that. Oh. But surprisingly, with all those different names out there, there are only 5 species of oyster harvested and eaten in North America. Even if we expand to some of the rarer Asian and Australian native varieties, there are only about 12 types of oysters eaten worldwide. And I'm not even going to get into pearl oysters. Most pearl oysters aren't eaten, they're harvested for their shells and pearls. Oh, I guess I did get into pearl oysters. The big 5 oysters in the US are Atlantic, Pacific, Olympia, European flat, and Kumamoto. They all have that great oystery essence that oysters shucking love, but they also have their own distinct looks and flavor. The Pacific oyster, or Crassotria gigas, if you want to be specific about the Pacific, is one of the most common species of oyster. But don't let that fool you. Just because they're common doesn't mean they're not a great oyster. Just like the Big Mac, this common oyster is a workhorse and gets the job done and does it well. Even though the Pacific oyster is the most cultivated oyster on the US Pacific coast, they aren't actually native to the US. These little guys came to the US from Japan in the early 1900s to help replace Washington State's shrinking stock of its native Olympic oysters. Pacific oysters took off big time when they were first introduced to France in the 1970s. They were frickin' huge in Europe, kind of like those metal bands that you thought that broke up are actually still touring overseas. Eventually, Pacific oysters spread to Norway, France, Morocco, Namibia, and other parts of the world. Okay, all that's great, but what do they taste like? As I said, all oysters' flavors change depending on the water they're grown in. But Pacifics generally are a briny oyster, meaning it already has a salty taste, so you can go easy with the salt on your own. Pacifics are mild and slightly sweet, with some people saying they get hints of fruit like melon, some vegetable notes, and a bit of metallic. Their shells can range from grayish-green to vivid purple and gold. Pacifics are usually long with a deep cup shell. So if you're just starting out shucking on your own, these are a good, easy oyster to start with. Some Pacific oysters you may have heard of are Tamales Bay, Sikuku, Kusi, Morro Bay Oyster Company's Pacific Golds, and Hog Island Oyster Company's Sweetwaters. Sometimes Pacifics are tumbled by their farmers. This creates stronger, more uniformly shaped oysters and gets the ridged edges out of the Pacifics. Kumai and Blue Pool are both popular tumbled Pacific oysters. Atlantic oysters are the great American oyster. They're like baseball, apple pie, and Hulk Hogan before the sex tape. Atlantic and Olympic are the only native North American oysters. These bad boys are bigger than Pacifics and range in color from brown to green. They're all grown along the Atlantic coast. from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. That wide variety of waters and temperatures mean that Atlantics come in all sorts of flavors. Overall, Atlantics have a crisp texture, minerality accents in the flavor, and a savory finish. Most Atlantic oysters have a medium salinity, but the further north you go, the brinier these oysters get. Malbec from Prince Edward Island and Rochambeau's near the Chesapeake Bay have a nice salty flavor. Further south are the Gulf Coast oysters. These are the big, mellow bivalves you'll see served in places like New Orleans and Galveston. Ever heard the old advice to only eat oysters in months ending in R? Well, that's not exactly true, but that idea came from Gulf Coast oysters. Generally, people enjoy the flavor, but only when they're grown in colder water. The Gulf Coast can get pretty warm in those non-R months, hence that old expression. Gulf Coast oyster season is actually November through April. Also, when Gulf waters get warm, they can breed the Vibrio bacteria. Oyster eaters don't necessarily need to worry about Vibrio. Gulf Coast oyster farmers take precautions by breeding their oysters sterile and carefully monitoring red tide. Kumamotos are like the Pacific oyster's shy cousin. They take a little bit longer to come out of their shell, needing 3 years to grow instead of 2 like Pacifics. Kumamotos are also cultivated on the North American Pacific coast, mainly Washington, California, and Baja. And like Pacifics, they have pointy fluted shells with deep cups. These are little dudes with semi-firm meat, which they could probably take a pill for. People say these taste very sweet, a little salty and melony, with nuanced floral notes. So you know all the fancy oyster snobs just love them. They came from Japan to Washington State in 1947. Since Kumamotos have such a unique flavor and small shape compared to other US oysters, they're usually just straight up called Kumamotos instead of being named after their farms. Olympia oysters are the other native US oysters along with the Atlantics. These days, Olympias aren't super common, but back in the day, they were one of the most popular oysters in America. These were the oysters that Mark Twain and James Beard ate, but probably not together. People ate so many Olympia oysters during the California gold rush that they went functionally extinct. Fortunately, a small stock was found in the Pacific Northwest, and they've been set on a road to recovery, successfully being cultivated by a few farmers. Olympias take nearly 4 to 5 years to reach a decent size, and even those are about the size of a 50-cent piece. These little lads have a creamy and metallic flavor, they're tasty and unique, and definitely worth trying if you ever find them. The last of the oyster varieties is the European flat. These are sometimes called ballons, but technically they're only real ballons if they're grown near the Boulogne River in Brittany, France. These fancy fellas are usually seaweed green in color with a saucer-like smooth, round, flat shell and a shallow cup. They're native to the Western European coast and harvested from Norway to Morocco. In the 1900s, oyster farmers tried to increase the US oyster supply by introducing the European flats into Maine, but they didn't take. About a decade after that failed, some surprised Maine oyster farmers began to see European flats popping up in the wild and were able to harvest them. These are one of the most unique tasting oysters with an almost copper-like flavor. They're meaty and crunchy with a strong umami seaweed tinge. Oysters already divide people, and these divide oyster lovers. People either love or hate European flats. So those are the 5 types of oysters you'll find in North America. Next time you're out oyster bar hopping or trying to impress a date, try to recognize and order a new type of oyster you've never had before until you've developed a taste for them all. Speaking of dates, are oysters an aphrodisiac? Well, like a lot of aphrodisiacs, they can work if you believe they do. Oysters are a superfood that contains zinc, which can help with sexual function, but they've never been proven to boost libido. Hey, romance can be a mental thing. Alright. So if you think oysters get you nice and randy, then slurp down a dozen or two. It's not like it's gonna hurt your drive like those gas station libido pills. Hey Sunoco, I want my money back! So what do you think? How do you feel about oysters? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from Crisp Whisk.